Hello to communication and technology. So, the first two lessons, we looked at what is communication and then we looked at what is technology. And what became apparent already is that communication has a lot to do with words. So, today we want to focus a bit on how words make communication and look in the history of that, and maybe also look into other forms of communication that that precede writing and text. So today's lecture is on oral communication and the evolution of the written word. And we start asking a bit of the scientific context. Over the last 250 to 300 years, so in the time of the 17th and 18th century, people started recognizing that there is a history before what they knew was written down by ancient historians. That had to do with the excavations of ruins. The people saw ruins all over the place. I mean, they were not hidden. Usually, they were just an annoyance and were torn down. But at around the time of like 1600 to 1700, people started to think, well, maybe there is more behind that, and started to understand that these ruins could tell them about the life in ancient times that might not be totally straightforward if they just read about it in books. The first of these ruins that were thoroughly studied at that time were, of course, the very well known remains of the villages of Pompeii and Herculaneum at the foothills of the Mount Vesuvius outside Naples. These two villages had been destroyed and totally covered with volcanic ashes in the year 79. Under the ashes, everything has basically been totally preserved that was not flammable. So people 250 years ago start thinking of what culture is, what history tells, and also, having colonial exploration and starting from Europe, having these presence as colonial power in other countries, like, for example, England going to India and conquering India and staying there, or France going to North Africa and building a permanent presence in these other parts of the world. So the colonial powers brought with them, the need to understand other cultures. So in another culture, of course, first you learn the language, and then people understood that there is more. So even if you know what people say, they might not mean it in the same way that we do. And out of the necessity to understand other people in colonial times, was the study born that's called anthropology or ethnology. And that is the beginning of the scientific research into the culture of other people, contemporary or old. So we come to more of that over the course of this and next lectures. So there's basically three disciplines that deal with these kind of cultural studies of the past and what people are. The first is anthropology, which is the scientific study of human beings. Just to understand the word, what it means. So anthropos is the Greek word for human. So anthropos is Greek for human, and logi, the second half of the word, comes from the Greek word logos. Logos does mean the word, but also knowledge. So it's the knowledge, it's the science of the human being. A second form of study is paleontology. So paleontology is basically studying not only human, but any kind of remains that tell from the past. So paleos means ancient. So that's again very straightforward. So it's kind of the studying the old bones. And then is a third discipline, archaeology, which most people know from their normal vocabulary. So, and again, it's a Greek word, archaios, which again means ancient. It's just another word than paleos. So, archaeology is again the study of ancient things. Just to mention it, the ontology in paleontology is a bit different than the normal logy. There is the on in the middle, and on means being. So paleontology means the science of beings in the past. Yeah, so this is the three disciplines that we will look a bit deeper in today. So, and these three disciplines together form what we call prehistory. I mean, why do we call it prehistory, not just old history? The word history tells its own story. It carries the word story in it. And that's what it means. It is a story that someone told, and by telling, we mean, of course, had written down. So that begins rather late in time. So historic times are the times when people had already literature. I mean, the storytelling part is really meant that way. And the very famous first historians of the ancient Greek, which in the West at least are considered the first real historians, like Herodotus, Herodotus, writing about all these remarkable journeys that people do. Super interesting to read. Some of his details were always not believed. People said, well, he made that up, or he didn't actually listen carefully and misunderstood something. For example, he writes the story of this expedition that leaves the Greek territory, the classic territory from the Red Sea. I mean, what is today Egypt, belonged to the influence sphere of the Greek civilization. So there was this expedition about like 300, 400 BCE, going down south to the Red Sea, and they would go down south and further and further and further. And then suddenly they would realize that the sun would stand in the north. I mean, of course, why would the sun suddenly be in the north? That's, of course, unbelievable. I mean, actually, I mean, it is very well believable because they were just crossing the equator. But at that time, Herodotus had no concept of the what it actually meant that the world would be a ball. Sorry. So this is examples of history. We can read that and we can understand that, and we understand what he meant when he wrote that. The prehistory, we can't. We don't have anything to actually tell us. We have to look at the things that we find and interpret them, which is really different. And you see that also by the notation of, I mean, how old things are. We have a special notation, it's KY or KA, which means kilo years. Kilo means 1,000, like kilometer is 1,000 meters. So a kilo year is 1,000 years. And this is the timeline that we will have a look at. It's the timeline between what's called the Stone Ages. So the Stone Ages are three buckets of time called Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, and then the Bronze and the Iron Age. So these times are called by the things that people found of that time that were most prominent. So they would find, for example, all these bronze swords and bronze things in graves, for example, and then they would say, well, people obviously at that time had bronze, but not iron. Otherwise, they wouldn't use iron too. You would find gold accidentally at these times too, but gold was very rare in Europe and Asia, and so you wouldn't call it the Golden Age. This is why it's called the Bronze Age. And the Lithicum, the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, that lithos in Greek means stone, so that's the Stone Age. It's a total misnomer. People certainly had much more things that were not made of stone, they just didn't survive. And if you look at the time scale here, we lump together things in almost logarithmic scale. So the what's called the lower Paleolithic or the old Paleolithic, I mean, that's millions of years. That's really from, I mean, it depends a bit what school you follow. I mean, can start as early as the early hominids split from the other primates. That is maybe 6 million years ago, or others than from this chart here would say the invention of fire, the intentional creation of heat, which is maybe 3 million years ago. Um, no matter, I think people are more consistent when it ends, and it ends around 200,000 years ago, which is the onset of the last ice age. So the last ice age spans around 150,000 years, and is a major changer for how people lived on Earth, for many reasons. And then comes the Upper Paleolithic, which is then the fading out of the Ice Age, and goes into the Neolithic times, which is the time when people actually started living together in societies that we understand a bit better. So, I mean, the prehistoric is really the paleontologic uh, domain. So we have these bones, for example. Here, this is the bone of an ancient human who probably lived about 60,000 years before our time. And this ancient human is called the Neanderthal or Neanderthal. So Neanderthal is a small valley called Neanders Valley in Düsseldorf in West Germany. So in there, this skull was found around 200 years ago. And with the finding of this skull, people discovered that there were hominids other than apes that would look a bit like us, but would be so different that you could not, with good conscience, say they are human beings like us. And so the Neanderthal was the first of hundreds of human like beings that were in the last 200 years then discovered. The Neanderthal, in fact, is one of our closest relatives. It is by far the closest, I think, that we have, and coexisted with other human beings over a very long time. The Neanderthal story is very typical for how people in the West thought at that time. It was a vehicle of expressing racism. So the Neanderthal was immediately depicted as a barbarian, as a very rough and totally lacking culture, a human being that couldn't speak. And of course, then came the noble Homo sapiens, the thinking men like us with the big brains, and would just make the Neanderthal go extinct. Nothing of that is true. And it has been the last 50 years actually that people understood that it was totally made up. The Neanderthal, first of all, have a brain that is bigger than ours and probably at least as capable. Their skull absolutely would allow talking, probably in different sounds than we use. So there is no proof that the Neanderthals wouldn't also possess language. And if you go, for example, here in the British Museum of Natural History in London and see these displays, you get a much better picture now about these ancient relatives of ours than you would have like a generation earlier. Then you would just see these bearded, wild, kind of animal-like people in fur with big logs of wood as weapons or whatever. What really made a difference in understanding the Neanderthal was a lot of archaeological finds that could only be tied to Neanderthals because no modern human remains were found at the sites. And one is in Kafzi in Israel. It is a cave that was probably a burial site. And in this cave, you find the remains of bodies covered by ochre. Ochre is a red pigment. And you find also outside the burial places remnants of that ochre that show clear marks of scratching. So the ochre was deliberately scratched off and placed above the bodies of the dead. So the second thing that was found first there and then in other caves were flowers. Flowers were given as a burial gift to the dead, just like people do today when they throw flowers into the grave. I mean, that shows you that the Neanderthals must have had a concept of burial, of afterlife, probably. That was very similar to what we have today, even. What also was found was antlers of deer, of gazelles that were marked, and bone fragment engraved with small notches. The meaning, of course, is lost to us. So the thing, however, with the Neanderthal is the Neanderthal would only use what they find, at least what we know now. They would only use what they find in nature. They would not make things as a tool, at least that would survive, that was not entirely made of natural materials. So this is, I think, an important difference between what happened then, like 60,000 years ago, and what shall happen very soon in history, what marks then the split to what we call modern humans. So a beautiful display of the modern humans' early times is in Sharjah, in the small town of Meliha. So in Meliha is a spectacular site. I mean, you should definitely go there once things open up again. So it's about half an hour or so east of Sharjah. So if you leave Sharjah towards Fujairah, you just cross Meliha. So Meliha was not a very remarkable place before in the 1980s. A street was built, and in the middle of the intersection of the two roads that was built, suddenly came up the remains of a city that was probably 10,000 people big also. The city was from pre-Islamic times, so that means maybe 1700 years old. So around 300 of the Common Era, so maybe like 300, 400 years before the beginning of Islam. So it is a city in the middle of what is today a desert. At that time, the climate was a bit more humid. There's a small oasis too, and from the Hajar Mountains comes enough water to sustain human living until this day. So and then people started to excavate things, and the more they excavated, the more spectacular the things were that they find. So first, they found Bronze Age remains, big graves, a whole necropolis of hundreds of graves, probably housing like tens of thousands of dead people, which surrounded the ancient city of Meliha. And then they would dug further, and by accident, the excavation team, that was a team of German archaeologists from the University of Tübingen working there in the mid 90s to the early 2000s, they would have their lunch break in a small kind of rocky, overhanging, kind of bit shaded place. I mean, you know how hot it gets out there, and so they would have their lunch break in the shade and just look around and suddenly see that just where they were sitting, they would see much older things suddenly that were ancient Paleolithic tools, and would find there tools that were among the oldest ever found in archaeology. One you see here is the marked with the number 1 is 125,000 years old. So that is right at the kind of the beginning of the last ice age. So it's solidly lower Paleolithic, and the other is so much more old. It is more than 800,000 years old, probably, and it's a stone axe that was shaped deliberately, a very sharp flintstone axe. 800,000 years ago, this is not considered really the modern human yet. And it shows you that the migration of the modern human out of Africa, which took place about that time and was believed to cross into what is today Asia, um, at the the like Mediterranean shoreline, where you would go from Egypt now to Palestine, still over the Sinai, that there was more paths that people would cross from the Horn of Africa, from what is today Somalia or Ethiopia, into what is today Arabia, and populate Asia from there. And it makes much sense with other founds that there were these branches, probably many more, of people leaving Africa and populating the rest of the world in these waves. So the first wave reached what is today Iraq, what at that time was already a very fertile region, with the two rivers that would flood and made living there much easier than in the plains or in the desert. And from there, they would spread towards Asia, way until into the Pacific and through all the islands of the Pacific. Probably also over the Bering Strait and into the Americas during the Ice Age. The sea level was much lower, so you could maybe even cross by land or with simple boats, what is today the Bering Strait in between Siberia and Alaska, and to the other side towards Europe. So this is the beginning of modern human spreading out and colliding, so to say, in many places, in particular in Europe and Central Asia, with the humans that lived already there, that were of different kinds. For example, the Neanderthal. We now know by genetic analysis, from DNA that was extracted from the bones of the Neanderthals, that many modern humans, in particular in Europe, carry Neanderthal genes. So the Neanderthal might not really be fully extinct. It might be just been kind of sucked into the incoming modern humans. If you are interested in that, I mean, you can make a genetic analysis with one of these services. They all tell you how much percentage of you is still Neanderthal. So, and what the modern human and the Neanderthal have in common is that they shape things. They're giving shape, intentional shape to objects, that we see it and we know what it is. We know what they use it for. We understand that. And that is ongoing over the next 500, 600,000 years. Just to talk a bit about the misnomer of why Stone Age is actually doesn't make any sense. So around 30 years ago, so in South Tyrol, at the border between what is now Italy and Austria, there's a glacier, the Semilaun Glacier, and in that glacier, the remains, the frozen and mummified remains of an ancient man were found, who probably died about 6 to 7,000 years ago. It's totally spectacular again. I mean, the story is mysterious. I mean, he was killed, so he has a wound, an arrow wound, and died there in a snowstorm, and it was covered by snow. This is what people now, in forensic ways, reconstruct. So it's a murder story. And his man is totally the opposite of what you might have in mind about the Stone Ages. So his skin was covered with tattoos, very elaborate tattoos, abstract tattoos. He was wearing very sophisticated textiles. So not only fur or leather, but woven from grass. He would have several layers, like underwear, a vest, a jacket, and a warm coat, and an overcoat then of leather and fur. So he was very well prepared to survive even in the winterly ice of the glacier. Um, More remarkable even than his clothes is the things that he carried with him, which is a lot more than just stone. So he has arrowheads and knives made of stone, but most things are wooden or threads and ropes. He had 12 different thicknesses of rope and thread with him, some many meters long. So probably for climbing down a steep mountain or tying an animal or whatever. So what that tells you is that the culture existed at that time that was able not only to produce these beautiful and artfully made accessories, but also to sustain kind of this aristocratic or knight-like men crossing the Alps for whatever errand he had to do. Yeah, just showing another piece of his clothes, this bearskin hat that he was wearing, a very warm and waterproof hat of leather and fur. So this is the very ancient time and the reconstruction of people's technology. We are looking at giving shape to objects, which is kind of the basis of making communication technology. In particular, if you think of these the ochre in the graves, putting flowers in burial sites, and and decorating what you have with symbols. Although we don't understand it, we can relate to it, and we understand that it is meant to communicate things across people and probably over time from one generation to the next. The most impressive remains, we have touched that already in the first lecture, is of course the cave paintings. The cave paintings, in particular in France and Spain, is the only paintings that survived, which doesn't mean that not many other things were painted, but it's just that the paint could just not stay 60,000 years or 40,000 years or whatever time, other than in these very well preserved caves. So this is again, this is a picture, another picture of the cave in Nyon in the Pyrenees, South France at the border to Spain. This time it's from the inside of the cave looking outwards, and for scale, you see me standing in the middle of the cave, and then it goes inside for many kilometers. Yeah, these drawings of animals that speak to us in a way over the millennia that they have been there, although we don't know what they mean. Another form of communicating culturally is building things. So Stone Age people built really huge structures. So this is in southwest England, Avebury, in Wiltshire. So that's a bit southeast of Oxford. And so we have this Neolithic site here. So this is Silbury Hill outside Avebury. This hill is man-made, and it is 50 meters or so high. It's totally cone-shaped. It's a perfect cone. So you would never mistake it for something natural. So it's still there. It communicates that there were people at that time. The most remarkable feature of Avebury is the stone circle. So these stones are built in a huge circle around the village, many hundred meters in diameter, and from the circle out would lead avenues with the stones that probably has had some astronomical functions, although we really don't know what it is. There's a lot of speculation. The city has a big moat. Again, I mean, you would immediately see that that is human-made and not part of nature. It's ring-shaped. It's almost perfectly circular around the small town. And just to give you the scale, I mean, this is my son. At that time, he was 11, I think, when we went there. And so you see these stones are 3, 4 meters high and we weigh many tons. And the interesting thing is, they are not local. They have been brought hundreds of kilometers from Wales to Avebury. I mean, people must have had a real dedication to accomplish uh, their cultural site here. Um, how many hundred people you had under your command to make that possible? I mean, it's unimaginable. And clearly, it shows you that at these megalith stone circles, they the people were already living in very close societies. And you need a civilization-like society to organize spectacular buildings like that. Another way of seeing what people did, so we have the stone artifacts, we have painting, we have building, is ceramics. So ceramics is also really old. There's these very famous two first cultures of ceramics, the beaker makers and the corded-ware people. So the beakers were probably the first wave of people coming from Central Asia to Europe around 10,000 years ago, and would have these beaker-shaped ceramic vessels. And they were replaced about 6 to 7,000 years ago with another culture, the corded-ware people, who would make ceramics, all of these cords. And this is very interesting. These corded-ware people are believed then to be the first speakers of an Indo-European language. We come to this later in this lecture. The ceramics that I show here is in Dubai in the Saruq Al Hadid archaeological museum. It is this site that was discovered by Sheikh Mohammed flying a helicopter and then seeing that there must be some archaeological site down and ordering that people would start excavating and come out with this spectacular Iron Age village with sophisticated furnaces and foundries. And here you see snake symbols on the ceramic pot that we find all over what is today the Emirates and Oman. Yeah, jewelry also is a thing that people had over a long time to communicate, probably wealth, as they do today, to make them pretty. So the Abu Dhabi pearl, very famously, is the first piece of a pearl that was traded more than 8,000 years ago. The archaeological finds along the coast of the Emirates show that the pearl trade went all the way up over Kuwait into what today is Iraq, and in return all kinds of other goods were traded down, like, for example, ceramics or pigments that are not found on the in what is today the Emirates. Of course, we must not forget other forms of communication that we still have and that probably are as old as humanity. That is music, dance, and poetry. So, if you want to preserve meaning and have people memorize something that you want to communicate, it's always a smart move to make it rhyme. As everyone knows, it's much easier to remember the lyrics of a song than an essay. So it is believed that music as a mnemotechnic device, as something to remember meaning, is ancient. So the first musical instruments, I mean, that is the only trace that we have when people started making music. Probably they made music much earlier, but it's the oldest that we have is these flutes from a small cave in the limestone mountains of the Swabian Alp near Ulm, in the small village of Geisenklösterle. They're about 45,000 years old. So they're about as old as the cave paintings in France. And the musical theory that was reconstructing um, the harmonics show that it's a pentatonic system, quite like East Asian music is today, that people used at that time. So we can even understand the harmonics, although, of course, we don't know what people did with it. Did they use that at a festivity or to make music in a band, or did they use it to play for themselves while herding the cattle? This is, of course, storytelling. We don't know. So, with music and poetry, of course, we came now close enough to leave the proto-linguistic communication and go to the main part, which has to do with language. So, language, although we all speak languages, is really one of these things that always slips through your hands because it's very hard to understand. I mean, if you're a fish, you don't know you are in water. I mean, if you walk around as a human being, you don't feel that there is air around you. And with language, it's a bit like that. So language is always there, and you can't even remember living without language because, as it is believed, our memories are very closely tied to what we can articulate. And we will go a bit more into the also psychology of language perception in the next lesson. But what people around 200 years more and more realized is that languages are connected in a way that could be understood like evolution. So, I mean, of course, people knew that languages were similar to each other over a long time, and it's kind of trivial. If you live in, for example, in Italy, I mean, you know that French and Spanish is very similar to your own language, much more similar than, for example, German or Russian, and I mean, much more similar than Turkish. And so people knew that there were these connections between languages, and they even knew why. So, for example, there is the Roman Empire, and many of the people in the Roman Empire speak languages that are close enough to Latin today, like in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Romania. Um, while people in other parts of the world speak other languages and had probably similar conquests. For example, the Saxons in the 5th and 6th century came across the English Channel and settled England. England before that was Celtic, and then came the Saxons and brought their language with them. And in this conquest, the language of most of what is today the British Islands changed from Celtic languages to Germanic languages. And then later, 500 years later, the Normans came from the coast of France and conquered again in about 1,000 years ago, in 1066, And William the Conqueror came with his Normans and brought French. And this is why half of English is French and half is Germanic. So people knew that. I mean, this is not difficult to figure out. However, there was no concept of how that historically evolved because people in the 19th century started to understand that there is something going on like evolution. But before that, that was not a concept that people had. So there was kind of this idea of the Babylonian confusion of language or something like that. So what happened is that people found in these expeditions and in colonial, in particular in colonial journeys, that they encountered scriptures in very far away parts of the world. For example, in India, and came back with these scriptures, for example, of the Vedas. And if you look at the Vedas, they are strikingly, the language in which they are written is strikingly similar to German or other Germanic languages. And so people started to think, well, how can that happen that people in India, so far away, writing these texts that are thousands of years old in a language that's obviously related to our own? And with that starts a more systematic study of the lineage of languages. And these reconstructing these languages has a second really interesting point to it by finding out what people long ago had in common. You know what they had. I'll show you an example in a second. So, I mean, as mentioned, the Indo-European family of languages, Indo-European or Indo-Germanic languages, as they are called, were the first broadly studied tree of languages, starting with Sanskrit. I mean, this discovery that Sanskrit, the language of the Vedas, is very closely related to German, and in between is also very closely related, or I mean, as these all languages are, for example, with Persian. So, and that was the surprise. So you have India, you have Germany, and in the middle you have Persia, and people obviously spoke a language that was related to the two of them. And then you look closer and you see, well, I mean, all these European languages are very closely related, except there's a few odd outliers, like, for example, the people who speak Basque. So the Basques live between Spain and France. It's a small people, and they speak a language that is not related to any other language, and no one knows why, how that happened. I mean, it's a miracle, a mystery. Other languages are also notoriously difficult to learn for Europeans of the Indo-Germanic or Indo-European culture. That is, for example, Hungarian. I mean, Hungary is in the middle of Europe. I mean, it is part of the Holy Roman Empire and has been over centuries. Why do people speak a language that is then related to Finnish, which is in the north of Europe? And then people saw, okay, there is these guys in Siberia, really far in the east, the Yakuts, and they speak a language that's also similar. So and then from there you start thinking, okay, there was these migrations going on. It's not only conquests and opposing your language to people you conquer, it's also migration that happens so that people from one place go to another and bring their language with them. So that's the Indo-European languages as a good example. It's the best studied example that we have, and so it's always good as your first to have a first look at that. So what I meant is that you can reconstruct what people have is look at this example at the Proto-Indo-European, that is this reconstructed language that of course no one knows actually, but we can reconstruct by knowing all the other today's Indo-European languages and some of the languages that we have in written form that survived, like Latin or ancient Greek. And you looked at all these languages, you recognize that all these languages have a similar word for the horse, which is remarkable because the horse didn't appear before the last ice age, where the horses came from the Americas to Eurasia. And most of the people living until the Bronze Age would only hunt the horses for food. So they would hunt the horses for meat. They would not ride the horses. But riding is a topic that is common in Indo-European languages. If you see here, for example, the Latin word equus, the Greek hippos, or this ancient Persian yekvos, many other, like the English horse even, they are all very similar and can be tied to a reconstructed ancient word of the Proto-Indo-European equus. So we know that the original speakers of this language must have had a horse before they split up in all these different languages. And what now has been found is archaeological evidence that they indeed had horses, that they were riders, and probably the first riders in history. So about 6,000 years ago, 4,000, 5,000 years BCE, these riders came from the steppe of Central Asia, from the Ural Mountains, from the rivers of the estuaries of the Dniester River at the Black Sea, and conquered what is today Persia, Iran, and parts of India, and had this empire, most likely there, from where they conquered the rest of Europe. And these people, I mean, they are now called the Kurgan people or Yamnaya people. Both are Russian. So Kurgan is an actual Russian word. It means a burial mound. And the same is with Yamnaya. So that refers to their tradition of burial. Their sepulchral culture is to have a mound under which they bury people in a squatting position. These Yamnaya people conquered most of what is today North India and came up with the caste system thousands of years ago. And so the language in which the caste system is formulated, the language of the Vedas also, but also, of course, the ancient Persian, and then all the European languages come from these people. They were not necessarily very nice people. I mean, they had horses, probably they had other superior weapons, and by that could subject everyone. In particular, they brought the final destruction to the Indus River Valley civilization. At least this is believed now. And you see in genetic samples in Europe and in India how these people spread, and in particular how their genes have become dominant and replaced the genes of the populations that lived there before. And now we have it already. I mean, these early places. Let's step back a bit so that we are talking of the same things. The geography of these ancient people. So around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, the life of people in some places in the world changed dramatically. That had to do with a huge increase in the number of population, in population density, and with the sophistication in agriculture. So it's no wonder that these early civilizations, these four probably earliest civilizations, are all around rivers and river deltas. So the oldest place probably where agriculture led to the building of huge city states is today's Iraq, Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, Euphrates and Tigris. Then is the Indus River Valley at the border, what today is Pakistan and India. A civilization that flourished there over many hundred years and then declined with the conquest of the steppe people with their horses. And then, of course, we have Egypt, well known, and we will look definitely a bit further into that when we look into ancient writing. And then we have an old civilization at the Huanghe River in China. All these river cultures um, used the clay beds of the river, which is very fertile, and had, of course, no problem in irrigating from the water of the river. The three western of these, the Egypts, the Mesopotamians, and the Indus River valleys, were depending on the yearly flooding of the rivers, so that the rivers would have a different level of a different water level and would flood the fields at least once a year. If that didn't happen, there was a drought and people would starve. This explains why in all three places we have super elaborate calendars early on. Among the first things that were ever written are these calendars to calculate the times of the flood. The Huanghe people didn't need that because the riverbeds of the Huanghe are so thick in clay and it's so moist there that they didn't need the flooding. So the culture there evolved in a very different fashion. So this is another geographic uh, yeah, construct. It's called the Fertile Crescent. I mean, that is a word that was made up. There is no crescent if you look at it, but in the 1930s, people started to think of what was mainly British occupied territory around the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, like what is today Egypt, the Sinai, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, maybe Syria, and then up into Turkey, into Anatolia. That's vaguely question shaped. So that's the Fertile Crescent. This is kind of one of these, another totally pretentious name, the cradle of humanity, of human civilization. I mean, we should really avoid a pretentious language like that. I mean, what does that mean in the end? I mean, it's just the first of these civilizations that people studied just because all these British noblemen had nothing better to do while they were waiting in their colonial administration outposts there to do some kind of hobbyist architecture, archaeology, I mean. So, and then of course Mesopotamia, which is, sorry, it's just the region. I mean, basically, it's today's Iraq. It's the region between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and then, of course, where the two rivers confluent, and in the Shatt el Arab. So it's very close by, and a whole series of different cultures, starting with Uruk, Ur, Babylon, so the Assyrians, the Sumerers. I mean, all these ancient cultures lived there over thousands of years, creating most of the communication technology that we will from now on look into. Yeah, I mean, speaking of constructions, it's really important to be critical of what you see here. So this is from the book Ancient Times by James Breasted. So he was an historian who basically, by the way, coined the word Fertile Crescent. And you see with this depiction already, there's barbarism. There's everything before the Egyptians, and then comes civilization, and that starts small and becomes big, which is, of course, absolutely not how things were. I mean, it's totally clear that the Egyptian culture was great in three waves, and in between, it was not so great. I mean, it spanned a long time, so it's no wonder that it can't be great all the time. But I mean, the same is true for the Babylonians and for other cultures as well. I mean, they were not there all the time at the same level. And I mean, how would you tell that the Babylonians would be lesser than the Egyptians and the Egyptians would be lesser than the Greek? That doesn't make really sense. I mean, it makes only sense in this colonial racist mindset of the 1930s. It's important if you use the terms in the trade to understand that it comes from the West. I mean, it's Western thinking. It's the thinking of late colonial times in the 19th and 20th century that people made that up. I mean, if people in other parts of the world uh, would be heard in studying ancient civilizations, concepts of that would never have been invented. So we should be very careful in using terms like civilization in the first place. It has always to be made clear what we mean with it. So this is a really important caveat. And everything that we look at, even if I hopefully can provide some non-Western perspective to it, despite my personal bias, and you will immediately get that it is all about, I mean, the idea how Europe came to be. And at one point, I mean, people just understood that it was not only Greek, it was also the Egyptians that are in this kind of legacy. And then they understood, okay, it's not only the Egyptians, it's people in Mesopotamia too. However, it was never seen as how that plays out over the world. It was always seen as this kind of understanding how people in Europe came to what they are now. And the whole story is teleologic. It tells the story from the perspective of someone living in Europe and looking back at their own history and not into the history of other people, like all these cultures and civilizations in Africa, for example, that no one cared about in Europe, or hardly anyone. So this is really a big problem of all these anthropological sciences. So now we leave the prehistory and we transition into how people were actually learning to write. And the most interesting thing is that, I mean, like 200 or 150 years ago, so people were totally convinced it must be religion that brought people to write things. But that's not true. All evidence that we have tells a totally different story. It was accounting and administration. It was keeping books, how much harvest you have, how much taxes people pay. That was what made people write things down first. And then they discovered that it is pretty handy also to write down religious texts. So it's really an interesting, I would say, driver of technology. Again, it's the mundane, it's people's needs, not so much kind of lofty concepts. So if you see these waves of communication technology development, there's the Paleolithic, like with the Neanderthal, but also with the cave paintings and these burial sites. That is probably people didn't really live in cities. I mean, they lived in small villages, but were semi-nomadic because they didn't have proper agriculture yet. I mean, that is, I think, what people believe today. And they would use all kinds of natural materials to communicate in an artful way sometimes, but it is not abstract in our sense that we can still understand it. Then at the end of the last ice age, people started to live in towns. They start to have systematic agriculture, systematic irrigation. And at that time, they start to keep books of how many pieces of cattle they have, how many barrels of crops they harvest, and so on. And we find these notebooks, these ledgers of that time in tally sticks, which I will show you pictures in a second. And then in the end, we have the Neolithic time, so which is the time of the first great civilizations, where we have clay at the material as the material that we now still can read. So, and we will certainly have a closer look into the things of clay. First, just to show you what these tally sticks look like. So this is how how people marked these bones or wooden sticks. Um, Clearly, they are deliberately marked. These are from West France, around 14 to 16,000 years old. And we don't know what they depict. They clearly have some kind of counting going on, at least these small organized parallel notches. They are grouped, but we don't know what it is. It could be harvests, it could be astronomical observations. I'm thinking of the flooding. I mean, calendars were obviously very important to people. So, if you remember from your reading, the second chapter by Daniela Schmidt-Bassarat, and she makes the point that from these tallies and other objects made from counting, all other writing was derived. So these are the clay tokens that she describes. So in the upper part you see the clay tokens here to the right, and to the left the so-called envelope in which these small tokens would fit. So the tokens have, of course, a lot of advantages over other material like bones. So clay, in these river cultures at least, was totally common. And I mean, preparing it didn't require any kind of craft skills. You just take clay and form it. It's very easy to copy and to duplicate, and and you could use them. You can shape them in any form. And so this is the first time when people built communication devices that were not longer naturally occurring. So it's not taking a stick and marking it or a bone and marking it, but taking something that you make into your communication device. So it's a huge step, I think. And so these tablet or token-like, maybe that size, a bit big, like size of a coin or a bit bigger, they mark a point in time when people start abstracting into some kind of universal symbolicism of things. This is at least Schmidt-Bassarat's reading. Andrew Robinson, from whom you have the whole book, and the fourth article also in the readings. He's against that. I mean, he clearly criticizes that as to be simplistic. He says that the clay tokens co-occur with the tablet. They come at the same time. Here's a different theory how writing evolves. So you have here these Sumerian pictograms. So the Sumerers living in what today is Iraq, in Mesopotamia, one of the oldest civilizations there, from around 3000 BCE on. And they would use a small stylus or twig to scratch into the clay, and would have these simplistic pictograms here of a person eating. I mean, it requires a bit of imagination to see that, but I think it's not too abstract. And you see that over time, this symbol of someone eating being, first of all, turned to its side, because obviously people turned the clay tablet to write on it, because it's more convenient then, and it becoming more not scratched but stamped with the stylus, with the back of a triangular wedge-shaped stylus. And by that, step by step, writing would evolve. From these pictograms, it would be abstracted to what later become cuneiforms. So this is in the British Museum in London, and they have a whole display on that, which I find very beautiful. So you see For example, here these clay tokens, and then how step by step different formats of communication devices evolved from that. For example, the seal. So a seal is an interesting form of communication. You mark something with with a symbol that is personal to you. A seal is something that tells of ownership, that tells of identity. So in Mesopotamia, the seals that are found are often stunningly beautiful. I mean, they are works of art that are awe-abiding 6,000 years later. There are these small, semi-precious stones, intricately carved. Here you see that in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. So John Pierpont Morgan, oil and money magnate of the late 19th century. He was a collector of Assyrian art, among other things, and has quite a collection of these beautiful seals that are now on display in the library. And the relief that is carved into the seal is so intricate that you can't really see it unless you make a blow up and enlarge it. These seals were usually cylindrical and rolled over clay into the clay, probably to sign your document, or could be, of course, rolled in ink and then over paper, but that didn't survive. They could be worn on a necklace, like you see here. Um, this is, I think, this is in Berlin. The display is in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Yeah, and here a bit larger. I mean, you see these scenes of these griffins fighting and the dogs. I mean, of course, it's very hard to make a counterfeit of that seal, so it actually proves the originality and the authenticity, the origin and authenticity of something. Here's another example of this griffin creature, and you see the cuneiforms on the sides, so it has writing on it. Yeah, these seals are at the edge between the pre-literate and the writing times, and of course survive that. We will have a much closer look at the alphabets in the next lecture, but not before we close with a culture that is from somewhere really different, a culture from the Americas. It's the Incas. And the Incas had a totally different way of non-written communication than I would know anywhere else in the world. It's the Xipu or Quipu. So the quipus are these threads, cotton threads that are tied together into these small knots. So you have the threads, and from the main thread go down these hanging threads with knots in different sizes, and the threads have different colors. And that is a full-scale communication system, a language. So what we see here is an administrative Shipu who would, so the Shipu writer, the scribe, would notarize administrative matters like taxes and accounting with the Shipu like that, and preserve it. So the size of the knots, the position of the knots, and the color of the threads together, this multidimensional system is actually almost like a written language. The Incas would abstract from that and would use these accounting symbols to tell stories. So this is probably a burial gift that was given buried with the remains of a dead person, and it's a so-called narrative hipu. It tells a story of any kind, can be very poetic, um, in this weird way, using these knots and threads. So just to open up the possibilities, it doesn't have to be always alphabets. It doesn't have to be always these signs that we have in our mind, because we use alphabets all the time. We all come from cultures that are very alphabetical. So there is alternatives to that, and people came up with very sophisticated and beautiful systems to keep knowledge and to keep records, in a way that is very different. However, we can still understand. So by that, we close today. Don't miss to remind you of the assignments that, as always, consist of readings that I ask you to do. Let's just have a look. It's on the website, and you click at the link, and that leads you to the spreadsheet. And there is the assignments for today, that you please read Robinson Writing and Script, and so on. Yeah, because next lecture is then about proper writing, the alphabet, and from there we go on through all the communication technologies that people came up in the last 2000 years, like the book, the library, print, the telegraph, and the internet in the end.